In today's story, a farmer walks into a luxury car dealership and gets laughed at. The salesman called him poor, told him to leave, said he was wasting everyone's time. But what that salesman didn't know was about to cost him the biggest sale of his entire career. This is a story about assumptions, about greed, and about why you should never, ever judge someone by the mud on their boots. Stay until the end. The moment that salesman realizes his mistake, you won't believe it. It was a warm Saturday morning in a small town called Millbrook. Population about 8,000 people. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the diner served the same breakfast special for 30 years, where handshakes still meant something. About 5 miles outside of town, there was a farm, 200 acres of land, cornfields, cattle, a red barn that had been standing since the 1950s. And the man who owned it all was named George Whitaker. George was 62 years old, tall, strong shoulders from decades of hard work, weathered skin from years under the sun, calloused hands that knew every inch of his land. He wore what he always wore: faded jeans, work boots, a flannel shirt, and an old baseball cap with the logo of a tractor company. George wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. He'd inherited the farm from his father, and over the years, he'd turned it into one of the most successful operations in the county. He'd invested smart, diversified his crops, bought the land next door when it went up for sale, partnered with organic distributors in the city. And now, at 62, George was what most people would call wealthy. Not that you'd know it by looking at him. He still drove the same pickup truck he'd bought 15 years ago, still shopped at the same local hardware store, still ate breakfast at Martha's Diner every Sunday. But today was different. Today, George was going to buy a new car. Not for himself, for his daughter. Her name was Emily. She was 30 years old, a veterinarian, and she'd just opened her own clinic 2 towns over. George was incredibly proud of her, and he wanted to get her something special, something reliable, something she'd love. So he decided to surprise her with a car, a really nice car. He got in his old pickup truck, drove into the city, and headed toward Prestige Motors, the biggest luxury car dealership in the area. As he pulled into the parking lot, he looked around. Shiny showrooms, glass walls, cars that cost more than most people's houses. George parked his truck, stepped out, and walked toward the entrance. He didn't look like the typical customer, but he didn't care. He was here to buy a car for his little girl, and nothing was going to stop him. The moment George walked through the glass doors, he felt it. Eyes on him. The dealership was sleek, modern, all white marble floors and chrome accents. Luxury cars lined up like pieces of art. A few salespeople stood near the desks, talking to each other. One of them, a young guy in his late 20s, slicked back hair, expensive suit, glanced at George and smirked. His name was Brendan Cole. Brendan had been working at Prestige Motors for 3 years. He was good at his job, smooth, confident, and he knew exactly how to close a deal. He also knew how to spot a waste of time, and to him, George looked like exactly that. Brendan nudged his coworker, a woman named Jessica, and nodded toward George. "Check this out," he muttered. Jessica glanced over. "Be nice, Brendan." "I'm always nice," Brendan said with a grin. Watch this." He straightened his tie and walked toward George with a practiced smile. "Good morning, sir," Brendan said, his tone polite but condescending. "Can I help you with something?" George turned to him. "Yeah, I'm looking to buy a car." Brendan's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered with doubt. "A car," he repeated. "Okay. Well, we have a lot of great options here. What's your budget?" George thought for a moment. "I'm not sure yet. I want to see what you've got." Brendan glanced at George's muddy boots, his worn flannel shirt, the baseball cap. "Right," Brendan said slowly. "Well, just so you know, our vehicles start at around 50,000, and they go up from there." "That's fine," George said calmly. Brendan raised an eyebrow. "You're looking to spend $50,000? "Maybe more," George said. "Depends on the car." Brendan's smile became strained. "Okay, well, let me ask, are you pre-approved for financing? Because we do require—" "I'm paying cash," George said simply. Brendan blinked. "Cash. That's right." There was a long pause. Brendan looked George up and down again. Then he let out a small laugh. "Sir, I appreciate you coming in, but I don't think you understand the kind of dealership this is. We're not selling used trucks here. These are luxury vehicles, high-end, for serious buyers." George's expression didn't change. "I am a serious buyer." "Are you?" Brendan said, his tone sharpening. "Because, no offense, but you don't really look like someone who can afford a car from Prestige Motors." George stayed calm. "What does someone who can afford a car look like?" Brendan gestured around the showroom. "Well, they're usually not wearing boots covered in dirt." A few people nearby glanced over. Jessica, the other salesperson, winced. George looked at Brendan for a long moment. Then he said, "I came here to buy a car. If you don't want to sell me one, I'll go somewhere else." Brendan crossed his arms. "Look, I'm just trying to save you some time. These cars aren't cheap, and I don't want you to be embarrassed when you realize you can't afford them." George nodded slowly. "I see. I'm sure there are other dealerships that might be a better fit for you," Brendan continued. "Maybe something more practical." George didn't move. Brendan's smile turned cold. "So unless you have a briefcase full of cash hidden in that truck of yours, I think we're done here." George looked at him, and then, very calmly, he said, "All right." He turned and walked toward the door. Brendan watched him go, shaking his head. Jessica walked over. "You didn't have to be so rude." Brendan shrugged. "Please, that guy wasn't going to buy anything. I saved us both time." "You don't know that." "Trust me," Brendan said. "I've been doing this long enough. I can spot a time waster from a mile away." Jessica didn't respond. She just watched as George walked out the door. And, for some reason, she had a feeling Brendan had just made a huge mistake. George sat in his truck in the parking lot for a minute. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. He'd dealt with people like Brendan before, people who judged you before you even opened your mouth. But he didn't come all the way out here to leave empty-handed. So he pulled out his phone and started looking up other dealerships nearby. And then he saw something. A small sign near the edge of the Prestige Motors lot. Premium Collection Showroom, by appointment only. George squinted at it. He'd heard about this. The premium showroom was where they kept the really expensive cars. The limited editions, the custom builds, the cars that most people only saw in magazines. He looked back at the main showroom. Then he looked at the premium building. And he made a decision. He got out of his truck and walked toward the premium showroom. The building was smaller, more exclusive, all glass and steel. There was a security guard near the entrance. "Can I help you, sir?" the guard asked. "I'd like to look at the cars," George said. The guard hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but—" "I'm sorry, sir. The premium showroom is by appointment only." George nodded. "Is there someone I can talk to? I'm serious about buying." The guard looked skeptical. "What kind of vehicle are you interested in?" Before George could answer, a voice called out from behind him. "Hey!" George turned. It was Brendan. He was walking toward them with two other salespeople. "I thought I told you to leave," Brendan said, loud enough for people in the parking lot to hear. George stayed calm. "I'm just trying to look at some cars." "In the premium showroom?" Brendan laughed. "Are you serious right now?" One of the other salespeople, a man named Kyle, smirked. "What's going on?" "This guy thinks he can afford a car from the premium collection," Brendan said, shaking his head. "I already told him he's in the wrong place." Kyle looked George up and down. "Dude, those cars start at $200,000. "I know," George said quietly. Brendan stepped closer. "Okay, let me spell this out for you. You cannot afford these cars. I don't care what you think. I don't care what you say. You're wasting everyone's time." A small crowd was starting to gather. Customers, salespeople, even a couple of the detailing staff. George's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I came here to buy a car for my daughter. If you won't help me, just say so." "I already did," Brendan said, "but you don't seem to get it." Jessica, who had followed them outside, stepped forward. "Brendan, come on. Just let him look." Brendan turned to her. "Are you kidding? Look at him, Jess. He's a farmer. He probably doesn't even have a bank account." The words hung in the air. George looked at Brendan, and for the first time his expression hardened. "You done?" George asked quietly. Brendan crossed his arms. "Yeah, I'm done. Now get out of here before I call security." George nodded slowly. Then he turned to the guard. "Can you do me a favor?" The guard raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Call your manager. Tell them George Whitaker is here. And tell them I'm ready to make a purchase." Brendan laughed. "Oh, this is getting ridiculous." But the guard pulled out his phone. He stepped aside and made a call. A minute later, he lowered the phone and looked at George with wide eyes. "Mr. Whitaker, the manager said to bring you inside immediately." Brendan's smile faltered. "What?" he said. The guard opened the door to the premium showroom. "Right this way, sir." George walked past Brendan without a word. Brendan stood there, stunned. Jessica looked at him. What just happened? Brendan had no idea. Inside the premium showroom, it was quiet, elegant, only 5 cars on display. A midnight blue Porsche 911 Turbo S, a pearl white Mercedes-Maybach S-Class, a jet black Bentley Continental GT, a silver Aston Martin DB11, and in the center, under a spotlight, a custom matte gray Rolls-Royce Cullinan. George stood in the middle of the room, taking it all in. A moment later, a man in his 50s walked in. He was wearing a tailored suit and had a warm, genuine smile. His name was Robert Chen. He was the dealership's general manager. "Mr. Whitaker," Robert said, extending his hand, "it's an honor to meet you." George shook his hand. "You know who I am?" Robert smiled. "Of course. You're one of the largest agricultural suppliers in the region. I've been trying to get in touch with you for months about a potential partnership." George looked surprised. "You have?" "Absolutely. We're looking into sustainable transport solutions for organic farming operations. Your company came highly recommended." George nodded slowly. "Well, I'm here for something a little different today." "I heard," Robert said, "you're looking for a car for your daughter?" "That's right." Robert's expression softened. "That's wonderful. What does she do?" "She's a veterinarian," George said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Just opened her own clinic." "That's impressive," Robert said. "She must work hard." "She does. Always has." Robert gestured to the cars around them. "Well, let's find something perfect for her." They walked through the showroom together. Robert showed him each car, explaining the features, the safety ratings, the warranties. George listened carefully. He wasn't flashy. He didn't care about showing off. He just wanted something safe, reliable, and beautiful for his daughter. After a while, they stopped in front of the Mercedes-Maybach. "This one," George said. "She'd love this." Robert smiled. "Excellent choice. It's one of the safest luxury sedans on the market, and the interior is incredibly comfortable." "How much?" $215,000. George nodded. "I'll take it." Robert didn't even blink. "Wonderful. Let me get the paperwork started." As they walked toward the office, Robert paused. "By the way, I heard there was some kind of incident outside earlier, with one of our salespeople." George looked at him. "Yeah, guy named Brendan." Robert's jaw tightened. "What happened?" George shrugged. "He didn't think I could afford a car. Told me to leave." Robert's expression darkened. "I'm very sorry about that. That's completely unacceptable." "It's all right," George said. "I've dealt with worse." "That doesn't make it right," Robert said firmly. "I'll handle it." George nodded. But as they walked into the office, something unexpected happened. There was a young woman sitting in the waiting area. She looked upset. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. George glanced at her, then looked at Robert. "Is she okay?" Robert lowered his voice. "That's Sarah. She's one of our finance coordinators. She just found out her car broke down this morning. Transmission failure. And she doesn't have the money to fix it." George looked at Sarah for a long moment. Then he said, "How much does she need?" Robert blinked. "I'm sorry." "To fix her car. How much?" "I think she said around $3,000. But Mr. Whitaker, you don't have to—" George pulled out his wallet. He took out a stack of bills and handed it to Robert. "Give this to her," George said quietly. "Tell her it's a gift. No strings attached." Robert stared at the money. "Mr. Whitaker, this is incredibly generous." "She needs help," George said simply. "I can help, so I will." Robert's eyes softened. "You're a good man." George shrugged. "Just doing what's right." Robert walked over to Sarah and handed her the money. Her eyes went wide. She looked at George, then back at Robert. I don't understand," she stammered. "Mr. Whitaker wanted to help," Robert said gently. Sarah stood up. tears streaming down her face. She walked over to George. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." George gave her a kind smile. "You're welcome. Take care of yourself." Sarah nodded, still crying, and left the showroom. Robert looked at George with newfound respect. "You're not like most people who walk in here," Robert said. George smiled slightly. "I'm just a farmer." "No," Robert said. "You're a lot more than that." While George was finalizing the paperwork in Robert's office, word was spreading through the main showroom. Jessica had overheard part of the conversation. "Wait, that farmer guy is buying a Maybach?" one of the salespeople said. "Apparently," Jessica said, "and he paid cash for Sarah's car repair, too." Kyle, who had been outside with Brendan earlier, looked stunned. "You're joking." "I'm not." Brendan, who was sitting at his desk, overheard the conversation. His stomach dropped. "That's impossible," he muttered. Jessica walked over to him. "It's not. Robert confirmed it. That man you just kicked out, he's one of the wealthiest people in the county." Brendan's face went pale. "What?" "George Whitaker. He owns Whitaker Agricultural Enterprises. They supply half the organic farms in 3 states. Brendan felt like the floor was falling out from under him. "How much is the Maybach?" he asked quietly. $215,000, Jessica said. Brendan did the math in his head. His commission on a sale like that would have been over $10,000, the biggest sale of his career, and he had just told the buyer to leave. "Oh my God," Brendan whispered. Jessica looked at him with a mixture of pity and disappointment. "You really messed up, Brendan." Brendan sat there, staring at his desk, realizing the magnitude of his mistake. And he knew. It was about to get worse. An hour later, George walked out of the premium showroom with Robert. The paperwork was done. The car was his. Delivery was scheduled for next week. Robert shook his hand. "Thank you for your business, Mr. Whitaker. Your daughter is very lucky." "Thank you for the help," George said. As they walked toward the main showroom, George noticed the crowd of salespeople gathered near the windows. They were all staring at him. Robert noticed, too. "Let me address this," Robert said quietly. He walked into the main showroom, and George followed. The room went silent. Robert's expression was calm, but there was steel in his voice. "Can I have everyone's attention, please?" All the salespeople turned to face him. "I'd like to introduce you to Mr. George Whitaker," Robert said. "He just purchased a Mercedes Maybach S-Class from our premium collection. Cash, $215,000. You could hear a pin drop." Brendan's face went bright red. Robert continued. "Mr. Whitaker is the founder and CEO of Whitaker Agricultural Enterprises, one of the most successful agricultural companies in the region, and a valued member of our community." He paused, letting the words sink in. He came here today to buy a car for his daughter, and instead of being treated with the respect every customer deserves, he was humiliated in our parking lot. Brendan looked like he wanted to disappear. Robert turned to him. "Brendan, my office, now." Brendan stood up slowly, his hands shaking. As he walked past George, he stopped. "Mr. Whitaker, He struggled to find words. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "You didn't know what?" George interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "That I had money? That I was successful?" Brendan swallowed hard. I made a mistake." George looked at him. The mistake wasn't that you didn't know who I was. The mistake was that you thought it mattered. Brendan opened his mouth, but no words came out. George continued, "You judged me because of my boots, my clothes, the truck I drove. You decided I wasn't worth your time because I didn't look like your idea of a rich person." He took a step closer. "But here's the thing. Respect isn't something you give only to people who look successful. It's something you give to everyone. Because you never know who you're talking to. And more importantly, it's just the right thing to do." The entire showroom was silent. Brendan looked down. "You're right. I'm sorry." George nodded. "I hope you learn from this." He turned to Robert. "Thank you again for everything." "My pleasure," Robert said. George walked toward the exit. As he reached the door, he turned back and looked at Brendan one last time. "By the way," George said, "that commission you just lost? I'm going to make sure it goes to Jessica. She was the only one who tried to help." Brendan's face crumbled. George walked out. Robert's office. 10 minutes later. Brendan sat across from Robert's desk, his head in his hands. "Do you understand what you did?" Robert asked, his voice cold. "Yes, sir," Brendan said quietly. "You cost this dealership a major sale. You humiliated a potential client. And you violated every principle this company stands for." Brendan nodded. "I know. I messed up." Robert leaned back in his chair. "Messed up is an understatement. You judged a man based on his appearance. You embarrassed him in front of other customers. And you turned away someone who could have become a long-term client." "I'm sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," Robert interrupted. "This isn't the first time you've acted like this. I've had complaints before, but I gave you the benefit of the doubt." Brendan looked up, panic in his eyes. "Please, Mr. Chen, I need this job. I'll do better. I promise." Robert was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're suspended. 2 weeks. No pay. When you come back, you'll be on probation. One more incident like this, and you're gone." Brendan's shoulders sagged. "I understand. And the commission from today's sale? It's going to Jessica, like Mr. Whitaker requested." Brendan closed his eyes. "Yes, sir." Robert stood up. "You have potential, Brendan, but potential means nothing if you don't have character. Use these 2 weeks to think about the kind of person you want to be." Brendan nodded and left the office. As he walked through the showroom, he could feel everyone's eyes on him. Jessica was sitting at her desk. When he walked by, she looked up. "Brendan," she said quietly. He stopped. "I'm sorry this happened," she said. "But maybe it needed to." Brendan didn't respond. He just kept walking. Outside, he sat in his car for a long time. He thought about the look on George's face, the disappointment, the calm, quiet strength. And for the first time in a long time, Brendan felt ashamed. 3 weeks later, George drove the brand-new Mercedes Maybach to his daughter's clinic. When Emily saw it, she burst into tears. "Dad, this is too much." "Nothing is too much for you," George said, hugging her. "You worked hard. You earned this." Emily cried into his shoulder. "I love you. I love you too, sweetheart." As for Brendan, he came back after his suspension, and he was different, quieter, more respectful, more thoughtful. He stopped making assumptions. He started listening. It wasn't perfect. Old habits die hard. But he was trying. And one day, a few months later, an older man walked into the dealership wearing overalls and a straw hat. The other salespeople glanced at him and looked away. But Brendan walked over. "Good morning, sir," he said with a genuine smile. "Welcome to Prestige Motors. How can I help you today?" The man smiled back. "I'm looking to buy a car for my grandson." "I'd be happy to help," Brendan said. "What's he like?" And, as they talked, Brendan realized something. It didn't matter what the man was wearing. It didn't matter what he looked like. What mattered was treating him with respect. Because that's what people deserve. All people. George Whitaker had taught him that lesson, the hard way. Never judge someone by their appearance. Because the person you overlook today might be the one who changes your life tomorrow. Wealth isn't measured by designer suits or luxury cars. It's measured by character, by kindness, by how you treat people when you think they can't do anything for you. And that's something money can't buy.